This video is going to be really fun. I'm Andrew Joseph Keith, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to build this stop motion puppet out of materials that you can typically find at the dollar store. Sponsoring this video are the students that have purchased my online sculpting courses, either the portrait sculpting course or the figure sculpting course. I really appreciate anybody that has purchased those courses. It really helps me out, allows me to do more fun content like this video. So thank you. If you're interested in learning sculpture, please check out those courses. There's a link down in the description below for both of those. There's a figure sculpting course, a portrait sculpting course. So if you'd like to learn sculpting in clay, I hope you'll check those out. Okay, be warned, if you're going to attempt this, it is kind of a complicated build, at least it was for me, so expect that it'll take some time to put this puppet together. This stop motion puppet will be made from wood and rubber bands, so it will obviously be cheaper and far less professional, but for under $10 worth of materials, I thought it was pretty cool. For materials, I'll be using some wood beads. These are about a 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter in diameter. Make sure that these beads aren't painted because painted beads can slide easier inside of the ball joints. So when you move it in place, it won't be as firm when you put that joint in place. Next, we'll be using wood dowel that's 3/16 of an inch in diameter. These fit nicely inside of the beads that I got from the dollar store. If the dowel is too thick, you may need to use a knife to carve away the ends so that it will fit inside of the beads. We'll also need popsicle sticks, toothpicks, some larger pieces of wood craft board, some rubber bands, some hot glue sticks, and some wood glue. For tools, I have a ruler, a mechanical pencil, a hand drill with various sized drill bits, an X-acto knife, some bolt cutters for cutting the wood, though you can also use the X-acto knife, a handsaw, or a bandsaw if you have one available, and a hot glue gun. The puppet is built around this little joint. The joint consists of a wooden dowel with a wooden ball at one end. On the other side of the joint, there's 2 popsicle stick ends that have been slightly drilled into to give a concave space for the ball to rotate inside of. I call these clasps because they clasp onto the ball joint. One of these clasps is glued to the other wood dowel along with some spacers, which are made from the popsicle sticks cut into squares, and then the other wood clasp is loose and only held into place by the rubber band that is wrapped around the joint to keep it all together. Once you understand how to make this basic ball joint, it's just a matter of putting all these joints in the right locations throughout the body. To get an idea of the general proportions of the figure, I used this diagram that shows the cranial unit measuring system of proportions. I copied the measurements onto a large sketchbook page. This cranial unit system is my favorite method of proportions for figure sculptors. It aligns really well with the bony landmarks of the body. You can get a free download of this diagram by going down in the link in the description below and joining my email list. Once I had a stick figure drawn in with the basic proportions of the body, I made an indication of where the ball ends of the joints would be and where the ends with the clasps would be. Then I cut pieces of wood dowel to size for the upper and lower arms and the upper and lower parts of the legs, for the shoulders, and for the hips. Note, I made a mistake by not calculating the added length that the clasps give to the ends of the wooden dowels, which is usually about 1/2 inch or a little bit more on each of the ends. This means that the proportions for this armature are off, and I'll need to lengthen the dowels on some parts of it in the future. I recommend making the cuts in the dowel at these lengths. 4 pieces at 2 inches for the arms, 4 pieces at 3 inches for the legs, 1 piece at 2 inches for the shoulders, and 1 piece at 1.5 inches for the hips. This is for the male armature. For a female armature, you want to switch those. So you want to have the 2-inch one go to the hips and the shorter one go to the shoulders. 2 pieces at 1.5 inches for the spine and neck. I can now add parts of the ball joints to the sections of the body. I put the wood beads for the ball joints on both ends of the lower leg, on both ends of the hips, on both ends of the forearm, and both ends of the shoulders. I lay them down on top of the diagram, and that helps keep me organized. To make the clasps, I measure out 1 inch off of the ends of the popsicle sticks and make a mark. Then I use the bolt cutters to make the cuts. Just a little ways back from the rounded end of the wood clasp, I took a 1/4 inch drill bit and the electric drill and drilled a little ways into the wood to create that concave area that will clasp onto the ball joint. We need 2 of these clasps for each joint that we put on the body. For several of the leftover parts of the popsicle sticks, I make measurements to create small square pieces of wood that will be the spacers for the joints. There needs to be about 3 spacers if a joint has a dowel in place, or 5 spacers if it doesn't have a dowel. So basically we need to make a bunch of these spacers. Then I added the clasps at each joint. The upper legs need some special clasps that are a little bit longer. To make those, I measure out 2 inches from the rounded ends of the popsicle sticks and make the cuts there. I need 4 of these longer clasps, 2 for each leg. Once we have our clasps, spacers, and the wood dowels that have the beads at each end, we can start assembling the puppet. Note: I forgot to use the wood glue to secure the beads into place onto the ends of the dowels at the beginning, but I recommend doing that at this stage before starting the assembly process. Okay, now we can start with the upper part of the leg. We're going to take that wood dowel and measure out the halfway point, or 1 1/2 inches in. Then place the 2-inch clasp down and make sure that there is space at the end of the clasp for the ball part of the joint to fit without running into the dowel. Lay a bead of hot glue along the center of that popsicle stick and place the dowel tightly against the clasp, making sure that the dowel is along that center line of the popsicle stick. Then, for the second half of the leg, do the same thing, but rotate the clasp on the dowel by 90 degrees, so that one dowel is flat on the ground and the other is perpendicular to the ground. I do this because it helps the joints of the puppet behave a little bit more like the natural joints of the leg. Now we can repeat the process for the other leg. Now on the opposite side of the longer clasps, we will add the spacers, those tiny square pieces of popsicle stick. Make a small bead of hot glue on the dowel and then add a spacer. Repeat the process for the next spacer and be sure to squeeze it tight so there's not too much hot glue in between those spacers. We want to have enough spacers so that when the ball joint is in place, the clasps will be roughly parallel to one another. If these spacers are not parallel, but the ball causes them to tilt one way or tilt the other way because it's too large or too small, that will make a weaker joint that's more likely to fall apart when in use. Once the upper leg is finished, we can then connect the lower leg. To do this, move the loose clasp towards the middle area on top of the spacers and hold it tightly in place with one hand. With the other hand, I take the rubber band and start to wrap it around that middle area on top of the spacers tightly. I'll wrap it and twist, wrap and twist, wrap and twist, keeping the tension on the rubber band so that it's as tight as I can get it. Note, when you're doing this, be careful because it's really easy for that glued clasp to come undone because of all that tension in the rubber band. That's why it's important to add the rubber band above the spacers and to hold the joint tightly as you're doing this. Once the rubber band is in place, I slide the ball joint in between the clasps and move the loosened clasp forward until the concave area locks onto the ball of the joint. Then I scoot the rubber band forward between the spacers and the ball joint. If you do this right, the rubber band should hold everything in place, and you can move the lower part of the joint around and check its range of motion and how firm it is. Now add the lower leg to the other side. Next, we can build the pelvis. To do this, we'll want 2 1-inch pieces of popsicle stick, some spacers, and 2 clasps. Take the 1-inch piece of popsicle stick and close to one end, put a bead of hot glue. Then add the dowel of the pelvis perpendicular to the popsicle stick. Make sure that the popsicle stick is in the middle of the dowel. This should make a T shape. Then on the other side of the popsicle stick, we'll want to add 2 spacers to make up the width of the dowel. Then add the other 1-inch popsicle stick on top of the dowel and the spacers, sandwiching them in place. Here's what it should look like. Next, we'll add the clasp on the side edge of this T shape with hot glue. We may need to add another spacer to the side as well. When we turn the T upside down, we can see this first joint of the lumbar portion of the spine extending upward from the pelvis. This is what it should look like. Now add the loose clasp and the rubber band around the clasps and spacers. Then we can take our 1 1/2 inch section of beaded wood dowel and place it into the spine above the pelvis. It should look like this at this stage. Now we can add rubber bands to the upper leg to make the hip joints and attach it to the pelvis. Here you can see what that should look like with one leg on the pelvis. Add the other leg on the other side, and it should look something like this. To continue up the spine, we will use some spacers and clasps to make some more joints along the spine. Place one 1-inch clasp with the concave area facing up and apply 4 to 5 spacers with hot glue. Then on the other side, we will glue on another clasp facing downwards so that these clasps and spacers make a kind of Z shape. So one's pointing up, one's pointing down. This will allow us to have one secure clasp and one loose clasp on either side of this part of the spine. Now add a rubber band onto the bottom part of this joint and lock it onto the ball joint of the spine. Do the same with the upper part of the joint and add the other 1 1/2 inch dowel with the beads on the ends that will be the neck and shoulders. To combine the shoulders to this dowel, I use a rubber band and wrap it tightly coming from different angles around where the dowel for the neck and spine and the dowel for the shoulders meet. Here's what it looks like at this stage. Now we can add the clasp and spacers onto the upper arm, starting with the clasp. Remember to give some space on the clasp above the top of the wood dowel so that that ball joint can fit in place. Then, just like with the legs, the first clasp will be at one angle and the second will be rotated 90 degrees to mimic the joints of the shoulder and elbow. Once the clasps are in place, add the spacers on the other side. Once the hot glue is set up, we can add the rubber bands to the joint and add those forearm dowels that have the beads at the ends. And then add the rubber band to the upper arm to secure the arm to the shoulder. Repeat this process for the other arm. And this is what it should look like with the arms and legs, but we're still missing the head, hands, and feet. All right, let's build the feet. To build the feet, I take a piece of popsicle stick that's about 1 1/2 inches, but to me this looked a little bit small afterwards, so I recommend 2 inches. Next, glue a slightly shorter piece of popsicle stick on top of this first piece. Then I add 3 spacers on top of those 2 pieces of wood where the ankle joint should be. Remember that the ankle joint is not at the back of the foot, but that the heel of the foot extends a little ways back behind the ankle joint. Now add a spacer to the side of the foot with hot glue. On the opposite side, we can add a clasp. The loose clasp will be on the opposite side where we added the spacer, and we now add a rubber band to the joint and then secure the foot onto the bottom of the ball that represents the ankle. And repeat this process for the other foot. Here's what the feet should look like once they're attached. Let's add a simplified head onto the armature. To do this, I start with a piece of thin craft wood that I also got from the Dollar Tree. I make some measurements to get a rough idea of the size of the head from the side view. This head ends up being a little bit small compared to the body, but that's okay if you want to add on a face later on with paper or some other light material. I draw out a rounded head shape from the side view and then use an X-acto knife to cut out the head and a small part of the neck. Once that cutout is made, I add some spacers on either side of the neck. Then I add a secured clasp on one side of the neck with hot glue. To add a representation of some thickness to the sides of the head, I cut out 2 half teardrop shaped pieces of wood that taper towards the front of the face and get bigger towards the back of the head. Together these will make a rough egg shape when you look at the head from above, which is exactly what we want because the widest point of the head, when you look at it from the top view, is towards the back of the skull. We can glue these half teardrop cutouts onto the sides of the head at about the level of the cheekbones, just under where the eyes should be. Now that the head is roughed out, we can add the other loose clasp onto the neck and add the rubber band around it and attach it onto the ball joint of the neck. Note, I later realized that adding the neck in this orientation made the neck really thick from side to side and thin from front to back, where in reality, the neck is just the opposite. It's usually thicker from front to back and thinner from side to side. This is something that I'll probably try to change in future renditions of these puppets. To make the hands, I made 4 1 1/2 inch clasps that will attach to the joint of the wrist. Then I added a groove to thin out the hands. But after I did this, I don't think that the groove helped with the design, so you can skip this part. Then I glued on some spacers onto the clasp. These spacers will represent the back of the hand on one side and the palm of the hand on the other. Then I added this onto the wrist to test how it looked. It's almost got a Wolverine feel to it with the two ends of the clasps sticking out, or it's like this, maybe. Repeat the process on the other hand. I wanted to add on an indication of the fingers, so I removed one of the spacers from the hand and then added a small end of popsicle stick that's about twice the length of the square spacers. I glued this in place on the opposite end of the hand as the clasp for the wrist. Then I took a small drill bit that's just about the width of a toothpick and drilled through the two ends of the wood at the end of the hand. This will make up the first joint of the knuckles of the fingers. The size of this drill bit was 1/16 of an inch, but it was a little bit small for the toothpick, so I had to drill it again so that the toothpick could fit inside. It is better for the toothpick to fit in tightly rather than be too loose, because if it's too loose, it won't have the tension that it needs to hold those fingers in place as you move that hinge joint. Then I added the toothpick to the inside of the holes I drilled, and once it was in place, I cut off the extra ends of the toothpick. Then I take another small end of popsicle stick that's about 1/2 inch long or so, with one end that's rounded and one end that's flat. Then I glue that flat end onto the toothpick with some hot glue. Then I took a rubber band and added this crude approximation of a hand onto the ball of the wrist joint. Now we can add a dowel to the back if we wanted with hot glue to give some extra support to the puppet. Because it is difficult to be able to balance this type of wood puppet or to be able to pose the puppet throughout a stop motion sequence without some sort of external support. When you're adding this dowel support onto the back, you may need to add some popsicle sticks on either end, hot glue those in place, and that'll give a little bit extra support as it's grabbing onto the spine. Without that, the hot glue won't be enough to hold that in place. Okay, there we have it, a posable puppet or armature that we can use for stop motion or just as a cool decoration. I thought this was so cool when I did it. I was really excited. This was a lot of work that went into it. I'm not 100% happy with this design. I think there are ways that it could be improved for sure. It took a long time, took a lot longer than I thought it would, but it was really fun figuring things out. I like this kind of stuff. You could experiment with adding different hinge joints in different areas, maybe adding on the toes with a hinge joint just like this one, different size beads maybe. There could be other ways to improve it. My hope is that you guys will go out and try it yourself and figure out ways to make this better than it is. This is just my second rendition of this type of puppet. So I'm hoping that you guys will figure out a better way to do it and then let me know. You can reach out to me on Instagram is usually the best way and show me how to improve this puppet. I'd really like to see that. This project took so much time, I didn't have time to actually make a stop motion video with that, so that'll have to be for another video. If you'd like to learn sculpting, figure sculpting, then be sure to check out the figure sculpting course and the portrait sculpting course over at Proco.com. There's links down in the description, and those courses, I really worked hard to teach everything that I wish I knew when I started sculpting, and I really appreciate anybody that invests in those courses. All right, now all that's left is to go out and build it yourself. Build one of these. If you'd like an easier method for building a wire armature that you can also use for stop motion, you might want to check out this video. Thanks for watching. Stay creative, stay productive. I'll see you in the next video.